Hello. We're now going to talk about animals with skeletons. In this segment, we're going to look specifically at animals that have exoskeletons. Exo, of course, means on the outsides. Animals with exoskeletons have rigid structures around the outside, and their bodies essentially are hollow with muscles running through the hollow tubes that make up their body. The example we're going to use first and foremost of an exoskeleton are crayfish. And we have an example of a real live crayfish here who's being very active and wants to hurt me. And you can see that he can move around pretty good if he wants to. He can certainly attack me if he wants to.
So we get him to move across though. Maybe we can put him out here on the...
I'll try to put him on the paper.
So when a crayfish, would you describe that as being a very fluid or awkward motion? I would describe it as being awkward. If you look at the main structure of the exoskeleton up here, it's called the carapace. And how many joints do you see in that structure here? Not many at all. It's mainly for protection, so it's not jointed. Remember we talked about in the other section, when you fuse joints, you lose flexibility. And that's in this part of the body of the crayfish, there aren't as many joints. But if you flip him over here, now his tail, if you look very closely, has a number of multiple joints across it. So the tail is the most flexible portion of the crayfish. Now this crayfish basically bounces around the bottom of freshwater streams, lives under rocks, comes out to forage for food. When it senses danger, a flip of the tail, and it's back under its rock. And so basically this is mainly, again, you think about the buoyancy of water. So when this crayfish is in water, buoyancy allowed to make them lighter and a little more agile than, this is not his normal environment.
A couple things that go with that I will say. The exoskeleton of a crayfish is relatively light. It's made of a material called chitin. The chitin itself is dead once it's secreted and makes the exoskeleton. At seams of where joints meet, there may be nerve endings, but for the most part, there aren't any nerve endings within the exoskeleton of the thing at all. But by its nature, exoskeletons are heavier than endoskeletons. And it's unusual to find large terrestrial animals with exoskeletons. There used to be movies about giant spiders that would eat New York. And of course those were fiction, because if a spider got that large with that exoskeleton, the weight would be more than its muscles could lift. That having a exoskeleton all the way around the outside of the muscle actually creates too much weight for the organisms to move. Now, having said that, exoskeletons are an amazingly successful evolutionary line. If we look over here at this little display, this is a tiny subset of the sort of insects that you would find in Pennsylvania. And all of those have exoskeletons. Insects in general have exoskeletons and are probably the most diverse group of animals in the world. So exoskeletons have been tremendously successful evolutionarily.
And another example, this is the larger crustaceans. Now the crustaceans, we call them, they're subphylum of the phylum Arthropoda, the insects. And just think, I don't know if you've actually ever seen a lobster this size, but this is the mass of the exoskeleton from a very large lobster.
The lobster can have a large exoskeleton in part because, again, it lives in water, and buoyancy helps support it.
Other arthropods here, and I want to just show you some kind of diverse motion that they can revive. We see that they're adapted for flight, but they're adapted for being very agile and running. And I'm going to pull out a hissing cockroach here. And allow it to move across the table. Look at that movement again.
He goes.
And again, you can look at the The tail of the cockroach is essentially jointed. It's very flexible, allowing for quite a wider range of movement for the cockroach right quickly across the surface. Keep track of him. And we also have some, these are called superworms, which is a very large type. These are larvae. And again, you can see this is the jointed exoskeleton here. This is actually walking very efficiently backwards. So that's just kind of a demonstration of the type of range of motion that the animal can acquire with an exoskeleton.
The second group of organisms that have an exoskeleton that we're going to talk about are the mollusks. The mollusks are very different from the arthropods. Arthropods, by definition, have jointed appendages. That is to say that they move by having joints along their legs and their arms. Mollusks lack that. Arthropods have exoskeletons that are made of chitin. Mollusks have exoskeletons that are made of calcium carbonate. Calcium carbonate is much more dense and heavy than the chitin is that make up the exoskeletons of arthropods. We have an example here of a exoskeleton of a mollusk. You might think of it as a clamshell, and in fact, that's kind of what it is. I say it doesn't have a joint. You usually find, of course, pairs in halves together, but there's a hinge at the bottom that actually is held in place by muscles. Within that shell, then, you'll have an entire organism that has gills, intestines, and everything else. And they can open and actually squirt water out and move around a little bit, but they're not nearly as mobile as what an arthropod is. So these tend to be bigger, heavier animals. They tend to sit on the bottom of streams or oceans and be filter feeders. That is to say, they feed on whatever floats past them. So this is an example of a calcium carbonate exoskeleton of a shell. They oftentimes have a very shiny interior. In the past, we have harvested that and called it mother of pearl and used it to make buttons and things like that. And these are, again, a relatively large and complex group of organisms, not nearly as complex as the insects and the arthropods, but it's a large and successful group of almost entirely aquatic organisms.
So I guess you can consider the main function of this exoskeleton of the mollusks are for protection, not for movement. If you think about the main function of the exoskeleton for the insects or the crayfish, is more involved in movement.